For 200 years, the work of Black journalists has been crucial to the lives of Black people in America. But the model for independent reporting is in decline, and disinformation prevails, targeted at Black communities. So we did something about it. We created a nonprofit network of local newsrooms anchored by a national hub, a different kind of news model for Black audiences, too often left behind, with stories too often untold. With our sustainable business model designed for the current market, we listen to and partner with the communities we serve to produce journalism that will expose injustice, inform policy, hold leaders to account, and equip Black audiences with the truth. Truth we deserve, news we need. Hello, and welcome to day 2 of Capital B Fest. I'm Akoto Foriata, co-founder and chief audience officer of Capital B. During yesterday's sessions, we heard from those working to change their communities through leadership in politics and economic policies. Today, we'll continue our conversation by focusing on the work being done in tech, both to solve problems within the tech space and to make tech more diverse. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you aren't already a member, please consider becoming one by heading to capitalbnews.org and clicking the Become a Member button at the top right. You can also sign up for our newsletter and email updates. We're so happy to have you here. Please enjoy the program.
I'm Sidney Fussell. I'm a filmmaker and technology journalist, and I'm so glad that you've joined us for today's event. Joining me for this talk is Sherelle Dorsey. She's the founder and CEO of The Plug. Thanks so much for being here, Sherelle.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're so glad to have you today. Sherelle is an American data journalist and entrepreneur. She's the founder and CEO of The Plug, a Black tech news and insights platform covering Black innovators in tech, venture capital, and the future of work policy. Sherelle's grown the venture-backed media startup to 1,000 subscribers, several hundred paid members, and has raised over $500,000 in capital. And an issue that I know is very near and dear to her heart is the issue of diversity in tech in Silicon Valley. The lack of diversity in tech is often blamed on the pipeline, and it's a more of a complex issue than you might be aware of. And so I just want to turn it over to Sherelle and just get started about what is the current state of diversity in the tech field in this moment. I know some major tech companies only have 2 or 3% of Black workers in key roles.
I mean, just across the board, when we talk about pipeline, honestly, it's not for lack of the support of organizations or people or communities wanting to be in these tech environments. Quite truly, there's an information access issue. There's also a challenge when we think about our education, our school systems, some of the failures in Black and Brown communities, and particularly lower income communities. And also when we think about exposure. And then, of course, quite generally, what we do best here in America, which is discrimination and locking people out of opportunities. So it's a very multifaceted challenge. And it's something that many organizations, many people, many recruiters, many folks internally, be it a DE&I team, an HR team, or just employees, particularly those who are Black and Brown, maybe they've hailed from an HBCU or historically Black college or university, who has worked tirelessly, like some of our legacy organizations, like the National Society of Black Engineers or the Black Data Processing Association, or even organizations like Compute Her, who have been around for decades, helping to usher Black and Brown people into corporate tech environments. And just again, part of the challenge being here that homogenous teams continuously choose homogenous teams. And every couple of years, we get this fanfare of let's increase diversity within tech, let's increase diversity within tech, but also having to recognize that some of these environments can be very, very hostile to Black and Brown people. We are seeing this influx, however, Sydney, around companies strategically positioning themselves within the Southeast region of the United States to start building those relationships with HBCUs. We've seen that from the Googles, the Microsofts, even down to Slacks and Airbnbs, who are starting to now bridge the gap with universities like Spelman and Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, Howard, even North Carolina A&T, which graduates the most Black engineers and other Black STEM majors in this country. But it has continuously been a challenge, quite frankly.
That's such a complex, really interesting answer. I really want to go back to sort of 2 points. The first, use the phrase DEI or DE&I. What does that stand for? And how far are we away from what it stands for and what is actually happening out here in these streets?
Yes, that's such a great question. What is happening in the streets? What's actually happening in the group chat when it comes to this particular song and dance? So diversity, equity, inclusion, even belonging, these concepts have been around for a very long time. There have been a lot of like chief diversity officers or team members within corporate startup spaces who have also, or tech spaces who have been tasked with ensuring there's some level of representation. Now, again, we can argue about, 3%, 5% here or there, whether or not that needle moves every year or it stays pretty stagnant, which we kind of have seen through the data has stayed pretty stagnant. But when we think about some of the movements that have really taken shape and have been on sort of display the last few years. When George Floyd was killed, we actually did an analysis in partnership with Fast Company, looking at the number of firms that hired their first chief diversity officer between 2020 and 2021. Roughly 70% of the 23 plus major companies that employed 10,000 employees or more had just hired a chief diversity officer to start diving and digging through how does representation show up in this company. So it lets you know where the actual state of affairs are. Whereas you had older legacy institutions kind of put people in place to start solving for some of this problem, maybe putting more recruiters at historically Black colleges and universities or majority Black neighborhoods and communities. But the vast majority of companies are still trying to figure this out. A lot of them still aren't even measuring the statistics as it relates to diversity, or maybe they're just now starting to pull together a report to measure and monitor diversity or create, they're now called like belonging and inclusion teams or employee resource groups. So a lot of this practice is hit or miss. There's a lot of challenges in the industry. You'll hear from some folks who are very talented diversity, equity, inclusion officers saying, yeah, like they put me here, but they won't give me any actual power or responsibilities. I'm not really part of the business decision-making process. And then in some teams, you really do see some incredible work being done. You see diversity, equity, inclusion consultants pop up and start to manage and create new recruiting pipeline and employee performance and development plans. So companies like Zapier, which Perfecta has worked with, Henry and Edgar and all of these other companies who are really taking this seriously and saying, hey, we have not done well. So I don't want to paint a broad brush that, oh, there is progress. There's progress in some institutions, there's progress for some people, but for the vast majority of Black tech workers, there are still ongoing challenges. And I think a lot of that was exacerbated, through the pandemic as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that it can be difficult to talk about this. You want to address the enormity of it, but you don't want to get caught in the statistics of it and the numbers at the individual level. What you said before about so many different companies didn't even think about diversity in like a real way until after the death of George Floyd. So then they hired in these diversity officers who obviously are aware of the difficult position they're in to come into these companies where this wasn't prioritized before, it's prioritized now. Just on the individual level, the personal level, what is it that the people who find themselves in these positions really need? Because they're coming in like a very racially charged, difficult time, a company that didn't have those resources before. What are the things they need on just like a personal?
I think on a personal level, they need to have leaders who are equipped and ready and open to actually have hard conversations and are okay with being disruptive and taking a look at themselves and their organizations and saying, hey, we have not gotten this right. That's a very powerful position to be in versus let's just hire someone to be the face of this, to be the headline, for someone who can just speak at all the events and make, our folks happy in the interim. I think that for those leaders, those inclusive, I call them inclusive business thinkers, where they are understanding that there is no more room for destructive innovation, that you have to be to survive in sort of the future that we're building toward, you have to have a spectrum of understanding of culture, of sexual identity, of socioeconomic understanding, and even of like policy from an infrastructure standpoint. Just down to housing or down to, down to food access. And it makes you smarter as a leader when you are a well-rounded individual who understands like everyone's background matters, even just religious understanding as well, right? And so those folks who are able to get paired with those kinds of leaders and join those kinds of companies are having a stronger time feeling like key contributors to the progress of their organizations. But for those who are finding themselves in environments where they are extraordinarily hostile and they're only able to stay there not even a year, that continues to be problematic. And so again, you know, the press release can be vastly different than what is happening on the ground from an experience standpoint.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really want to go back to that phrase that really resonated with me with this idea of a spectrum of understandings, because I remember, I mean, if the diversity reports started, let's say 2015, 2016, I remember in those early days where there was this idea of like, we don't want to lower the bar just for like diversity. We don't want to lower the bar. And what you're saying is so much the opposite of that. In order to hire people from different backgrounds, you have to raise the bar. There's a new intellect, there's a demand for, there's a new standard. A lot of people aren't hitting it though. To be honest, there's this new expectation that they're going to have these awarenesses around like LGBTQ issues, around poverty, et cetera. And we still see that these people in positions of power aren't hitting it quite yet. So how do we raise the bar for them? Because they said they have to lower the bar for us. How do we raise the bar for them and make sure that they understand what it is that we need from them?
Yeah, I think that particular language is so it's so disrespectful and it's intellectually lazy, because it really speaks to your capabilities as a leader, or your not even your capabilities, your incapabilities, and maybe your ineptness. Because leaders are supposed to be building other leaders, and as a leader, you are supposed to be shaping your teams and growing your teams to realize the most of their potential, and also cultivating pipelines and networks that ensure that you're getting the best talent, the best thinkers on your team. So if you're not making investments into partnerships with key organizations or institutions, be they trade schools or community colleges or traditional universities and colleges, then you're not even tapping into what can be incredible gems based on an ignorance that says, oh, we can only hire people who've gone to an MIT, a Harvard, a Stanford, or what have you.
Absolutely.
You do not get the level of perspective and opportunity to improve a product or expand marketing when you don't have an array of representation that represents all of America, every single nook and cranny. And so I think that's a failure of actual leadership. If you are 100% only comfortable in rooms where people look like you and think like you, you're going to constantly be stalled as a leader. And so I think it's just a lack of creativity, a lack of intellect to kind of automatically jump to because it is Black or brown or gay or trans or Muslim, that it is automatically less than. And unfortunately, that is an association that is far too often made versus how do we flip that and say, well, it's very intellectually lazy of you to believe X, Y, and Z. That seems very ignorant for someone that is supposed to be a learned person. And I think we're starting to see, and what we've seen following, George Floyd's death is many more tech employees, and particularly Black and brown tech employees, pushing back, being if before people were much more concerned about potentially losing their job or losing their position, we saw Black tech workers start to speak out. We've seen the unionization of Amazon. We've seen all of these different Black worker movements who are saying, you cannot have our talents and our minds and then disrespect our communities. Mm-hmm. And I think that has been significantly more powerful than any campaign or social media ad where, they're just spending money for like this nice thing to be said about them, versus we fundamentally have to make a shift because we are now witnessing Black tech worker power. We're seeing the lawsuits of Tesla, of Facebook, of Google. We're seeing the public, coverage, even just from a media perspective, of Black women who spoke out and were retaliated against by losing their jobs, now being offered incredible jobs elsewhere and still telling their story about being disrespected or being ostracized within the workplace. And so people aren't keeping quiet. And I think that's another shift in this is when we talk about pipeline is we're seeing a shift in people saying, listen, this is my actual lived experience here. Mm-hmm. It's not just enough to be brown in a place, right? Like that's not the work at the end of the day. The work is how do we get an opportunity to do our best work, to continue to advance, to build the future of technology. And what are the environments in which we can do that? And that's why at the Plug, we cover Black startups. We cover Black, venture capital. We cover this kind of global Black innovation space because we're also witnessing for the first time a wealth transfer, one of the greatest wealth transfers of our time. Just alone last year, over $380 million of corporate funding went into Black-led VC firms that then went into Black-led companies, people who are hiring now by the droves, hundreds of people. So imagine the shift in being able to go and work for a very well-funded, high-grossing Black tech company that might get a $3 to $5 billion valuation as we're looking at Calendly. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine the intentionality around creating an environment that is much more representative of America, where maybe I don't have to go and work for the traditional big name companies and face the same level of challenges, but maybe I can work for a company that's run by a woman, that's run by a person of color, that's run by someone who might speak a different language or have a different religion than me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so how do you, I guess, hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time? On the one hand of like, it is so important that, as we try to overcome the racial wealth gap and the disparities in education and things like that, like technology can be such a useful sector for that. At the same time, we know the mistreatment that happens there. And we hear the horror stories coming from, Pinterest, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. How do you, I guess, deal with that distance of like, this can be like an amazing opportunity, but also be realistic about like, listen, like you're getting yourself into something that can be like very, very difficult?
That is such a great question, because I've definitely worked for some of the big names myself. And on my mind was always entrepreneurship. And not everyone will have that opportunity or that capability. And everything is not going to be for everyone. Some people will thrive in certain environments because sometimes it's not the company itself. Sometimes you're just on a really great team, or maybe you're on a really bad team. And so in isolation, we can't just paint a broad brush of like the entire company, needs to be burned to the ground, because some of my friends and my colleagues and acquaintances, they love where they are. And maybe someone else in a different department running something very different is not having the same level of experience. One of the things that I do grapple with, Sydney, and this is probably something that, also comes up for you, is at the end of the day, many of us do not come from households that have long-term generational wealth. Mm-hmm. And there are times where you have to make the choice to say, what is my path to making the most amount of money that I can, leveraging the skills that I have, ensuring that I'm not carrying any debt, I can support my family, as we know that the vast majority of Black and brown people are not just building wealth for themselves, they're having to send money back home or help to take care of the family. So that cuts into our ability to even grow our own wealth. So if I can get into tech, or in some form of an engineering environment where I can make a six-figure salary right away. I mean, some of these kids get offered, a six-figure deal right out of college. Mm-hmm. And if that can drastically change your family's life, then you have to work towards cultivating an environment for yourself where you can get your support. And sometimes if we don't come from families that teach us how to navigate our college experience, how to apply for those fellowship opportunities, how to join employee resource groups or be part of groups where we can get the support, joining a Dev Color or a Color Stack or any of these kind of support organizations, we can be in isolation in environments that may not be the most psychologically supportive. So my encouragement here is that, listen, not all of us can turn down that money because we don't like the environment. A lot of us have to get the check and have to transform our company, our families' lives, our communities' lives, and then kind of move on to greater pastures. But in the meantime, this is where community matters. This is why having an Afro Tech, having a Black Tech Week, having conversations and festivals like Capital B, it helps us to all understand that we're not alone and that we can still build community as we walk through the fire in some of these environments. So I think that's the more important part of the equation. And then as we start to build our own, to continue to invest in and support the growth of Black-led startups that are severely underfunded compared to our counterparts, and also ensuring that the institutions that are funding more underrepresented founders continue to know that this is a key priority that we're looking at over the next few decades.
Right. And going into that sort of quintessential college kid who got a good degree and started work at a great tech firm, there's so much to process. I know that one of the things that I went through that I've talked with other people in the field is, if you grew up in a working class background and suddenly people are talking about like 401ks, retirement, paid vacations, those are things that you don't know how to navigate. It's like, oh, fill out this thing in the HR platform so you can take time off. I don't know anything about that. That's like not what I can relate to. And so I think it's really important to see that it's not just the work itself that requires support. It's the lifestyle that you'd gone after, that you said you wanted this lifestyle, this middle class, upperly mobile lifestyle. It had been closed off for how you grew up, and now you have to learn how to navigate it. Is that something that, like, how do you go about, I think, working through that? Shame isn't the word, but it's like, you do have to sort of step forward and say, like, listen, I don't know how to do this. I don't know anything about investments. Like, you have to say, like, how do I stand in this now that I've made it here?
I love this question, Sydney, because I think that we forget that sometimes a lot of us have already been given some tools that others haven't. And sometimes it is shame. Sometimes it feels shameful to say, I don't know how to do something. I wrote a book that was released in January called Upper Hand, The Future of Work for the Rest of Us. It's that blue and yellow book right up there. And I talk about my experience leaving a lot of money on the table at a tech company that I worked for because I didn't have anyone to talk to me about stock options and equity and things like that. That was a great deal of money that I did not know that I could have gone after because I didn't even have the resources to buy all of my stocks. And now actually looking at the market, I'm actually probably okay about that. But I came from a working class family. My family went to state schools. They worked at the same job for 20, 30 years, retired. They understood a very specific kind of linear pathway towards employment. I graduated in college during the heart of a recession. The world looked very different. Wages were stagnant, jobs were stagnant. I was part of that Craigslist generation of like, you have to pick up 3 to 4 side hustles just to get the rent paid. And so we're coming into an era of something very, very different. And even those fancy degrees that we all went to get, that was supposed to be our ticket, it didn't help us to navigate a very, very new world of work where gig economy work was going to be the majority of people's income. The world has changed again as we look at the pandemic. Think about the worker shortages, all the flight cancellations because pilots and stewardesses and server staff are not showing up to work or have decided to move into new professions. We're even looking at credentialing where you can get a certification and that can help you to get into the tech industry. Everything has changed drastically. And that's why in my book specifically, I wanted to give people some of the cheat code. I wrote the book specifically for those grandmothers in church who were raising their grandkids and they didn't have even the language to understand, well, what's a hackathon? Which companies are providing some free training that I can get my kid, my niece, my mentee, my nephew, what have you into. And so I think that transfer of language, and this is why Black-owned media is so significant because we're responsible for translating language and information to our communities so that they can also understand what does the language of innovation look like, especially when we're talking about the future of work. What is cybersecurity, cloud computing, all of these kinds of things. And so I wanted to break that down in a very easy to understand terminology because a lot of us don't get some of the key pieces. And I think too, Sydney, I love this saying, and it came up, I want to say maybe last year. It says, we are the new ancestors. And our own individual responsibility of saying, hey, baby, let me help you with your resume here. Or, let me help you with this fellowship application. I've helped a lot of young people just just navigate the things that, that they don't know and or understand. And I remember my mentors and big sisters and big brothers who helped me, who said, look, you need to start putting your money away in your 401k, or you need to, I didn't have all of that. So as much as I want to blame an institution or a system and the wealth gap and what have you, the reality is, it is up to us to have some of those conversations that maybe our families weren't comfortable having at the dinner table. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that happen online. We're seeing people do Instagram lives. We're seeing people create courses around, how do you break into technology? You're seeing folks like Ruben Harris of Career Karma, who has an entire platform that helps to match people to boot camps and hosting audio rooms to learn more about how do you break into tech. We all have to be brokers of information, whether we're journalists or we're just, in the community to share information. That's our job. We can't blame an institution for doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is keep us from the knowledge. We have to keep sharing and giving that knowledge. And that's why platforms like Capital B and this conversation and this festival overall are so, so critical.
That's so interesting, because I think the way you answered the first question about what's behind the disparity in Black workers is this idea of information access. And I think what really resonates in your answer is that all of these tech companies are not doing an excellent job with reducing the disparity in information access. These Black people on these platforms are still finding a way. They're in Clubhouse being like, this is how you invest. This is how you use Robinhood, stay away from this stock. And so I just want to spend, some time talking about the youths, the Gen Zers, because they're making it happen. They're on TikTok being like, how do I make a resume happen? They're on Clubhouse. They're on these like brand new apps that I barely know how to use, but I think they still detect the disparity in information access, and they're getting it in the ways that have meaning for them. I personally would not, go on like YouTube or TikTok or something like that to learn this stuff, but that information is there for them, and it's been incredible to watch their the way that they've like made their way, and like, this is how I'm going to go out and get it and make it happen.
Absolutely. And I love too, Kanika Oliver, she wrote a book called Career Rehab. She works in government, in tech and government, which has actually been one of the largest sort of employers of Black Americans in technology. And she hosts, I think it's every Wednesday on Twitter Spaces, and she'll have actual tech company recruiters in that room talking about, here's what we're hiring for, here's some free certifications you can get sponsored through our companies. And I think sometimes she has 4,000 to 5,000 people in there, like learning and understanding, like, how do I get a job in this space? And so, yes, however the information is being disseminated, be it TikTok or Discord or any of these new platforms, I think it's absolutely fascinating. Think about it. If you are, and I love the story of Dr. Nashley Sethis. Dr. Nashley is from Jackson, Mississippi. And I mean, of all places, like, you wouldn't think that an AI research executive would hail from Jackson, Mississippi, but she had to leave and get her education elsewhere, eventually joined some really strong startups, which got sold to Amazon. And then she's now building out a tech hub, a multi-million-dollar tech hub in Jackson. But imagine if people can stay where they're from and get the skills that they need, and you don't have the brain drain of, oh, well, I'm from a small town and I'm seeing all these people, announcing they're going to work in Mountain View at Google, or they're going to Twitter or what have you. Well, now maybe they get to have a satellite office and they can work in tech in their own community and show other Black and brown folks as they're walking by, like, oh, you work in this building? Like, I want to do what this person does, And so, yes, that the mediums have changed so much. And I think it is beautiful. And I love that it is permissionless. It is, I think the only challenge now here, which we always face in journalism is around disinformation and also, the scammers. So there still has to be a filter of, are the experts that say that they're experts really experts? Is this course actually worth it? Dr. Tressie McMillan Cotton has an amazing book called Lower Ed, and she's just talked about a lot of the challenges with the nonprofit education kind of industrial complex, where a lot of Black folks took out these major loans for these overpriced education platforms that were not worth their weight in gold. I think now they're getting refunds and those student loans erased. But we also have to keep out a look for that in terms of where we're getting our information from. A lot of times your local community college has great certifications. You know, you can learn a variety of different skills right in your own backyard. You can go onto the Amazons, the Verizons, the IBMs, and take these either free or low cost certifications, right online. So there's some flexibility if you're caregiving, maybe you have children or you're caregiving for parents or a loved one or what have you. So again, it's just about dissemination of information. And I list a ton of that in my book, In Upper Hand. I spent an entire chapter talking about all the jobs of the future and all the prerequisites in order to get to those jobs.
Because I think such an important part of this work is imagining a better future. So I would love to stay in this idea of like what it would look like to be able to stay in Alabama or in Mississippi or Texas, because I think that like, for someone from the South, you have to go to the coast to find work. It's that same thing of like, you get so excited when you see, when you're in New York City and see, oh, you're from, down here, you're from Kentucky, and there's that recognition, that feeling of family. But the reason it's so precious is because it's so rare. You're mostly not dealing with people like that. So let's just sort of stay with that and imagine what would it be like and what would it take and how can we get from where we are now to there being tech access. Why can't there be a machine learning researcher in Jackson? Why can't there be an AI ethics researcher in Arkansas? Like how can we get there? What would that be like?
Yeah, I love that question so much. I'm from coastal city, so born and bred in Seattle, went to school in New York City, eventually made my way down to the South. And I'm Atlanta based. I've lived in Charlotte. I've lived in Miami. And you're seeing these markets continue to grow. We know that the highest concentration of Black and brown people in this country are in the Southeast. So we're seeing those investments. We're seeing Microsoft, opening a campus in Atlanta. We've seen Salesforce create headquarters here. Even Birmingham is getting some attention as they sold the company Shipped to Target, and they're starting to build out new companies, and the universities getting more access to resources. And we mentioned earlier in the conversation, more corporate companies are partnering up with HBCUs. The vast majority of HBCUs are in the South. They understand that like we are only going to be able to get the talent that we need if we're going into the South, because that's where people are. That's where people want to be. Because if you're asking a Black person to go from an all Black environment with Black professors and Black, potential supervisors into, a city that now no longer has the kind of diversity that they're used to or they're uncomfortable, it's really hard to have that person stay and the retention to stay. So companies, I think, are really, really expanding. And I think universities are starting to understand that they have major competition. They have competition with the boot camps of the world and these kind of online teachers. That's why we're seeing this explosion of executive education or certifications coming out of like top tier universities where you can get a Harvard certification in like leadership and organizational management, right? You never have to step foot onto the campus. And so I think that there's a perfect storm brewing also, Sydney, where there is more optionality because remote work has accelerated significantly, particularly as a result of the pandemic. You're also starting to see again, education access shifting, less people saying, let me take out all these loans for a 4-year degree and let me actually maybe get some certifications and get my foot in the door. And then maybe my employer can pay for my education moving forward. And you're even seeing some companies start to create like their own kind of academies. But when it comes to place, that really is the work of cities and communities fostering an environment that says, what do we need to do? Where do we need to invest? Maybe we're a chamber of commerce. Maybe we are a business partnership entity that helps to bring companies into the fold. I watched that in Charlotte. I watched the Avid Exchange, even some of the Coinbases, the Credit Karmas of the world, their selves to place themselves into majority Black communities and cities. And I think that we have to continuously be vocal. I think we need to continue in our coverage and in our work as journalists to talk about those incredible startup environments. What I love, and of course, covering the startup space, is seeing these these Black communities and Black ecosystem leaders, like the Black Innovation Alliance, which boasts over 100+ ecosystem leaders in a variety of cities and communities, even from like Macon, Georgia. Macon, Georgia has a whole Black tech movement. Pittsburgh has a whole Black tech movement. So the more that we can pour into these kind of communities and bring community to people, whether they're trying to get into tech, learn about tech, or build their own companies, that they have a place to call home. And that's what keeps people, when they feel like they have a place. It's all about placemaking,
right.
but it takes intentionality.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I hear a lot from my friends that are in tech is this idea of like, you know, I'm the one that made it. There's like so much pressure that they put on themselves because they're the one that made it from whatever their situation was before into this brand new environment. So they're like, I just got to like put my head down and get through whatever. And I think that what you're, you know, discussing now is like, there could be a future where there, you know, the one Black person in the office isn't having to go through all this psychological, essentially trauma of like, I'm just going to just swallow all this stuff because I'm the one who made it to do this for my family. And I think it's like a beautiful opportunity. As we wrap up though, I just wanted to ask you one last question, which is how can we stay away from this sort of like moment by moment paradigm? I think we think of diversity in terms of like typically tied to a tragedy. So when you think about 2016 with, you know, with Eric Garner and then like George Floyd, and then, you know, it feels very like there's some type of like tragedy, death, murder, and then there's like diversity talk and it sort of goes away. So how can we stay away from this sort of like cyclical, moment-based, short-term thinking to do the types of structural changes and create the environments that you were talking about just now?
Yeah, we have to all be futurists. We all have to be futurists. If we're going to have a bright future that pushes our country forward, we all have to be futurists. We all have to be thinking about, in order to build the future, we have to invest in the people that will build the future. Just point blank period, from a competitive standpoint. We cannot afford to keep having the same conversation decade after decade. I know we've all got to be exhausted. But so if our solutions can go through a lens of what will it take to ensure the long-term survival and skill building and rapid reskilling of people and communities to ensure that we have a future that makes sense and operates effectively. Right now, we are witnessing, again, just one of the most major employment catastrophes of our time. Flight cancellations,
Yes.
You know, restaurants having to go out of business because there's worker shortages, things like that. You know, obviously there is a funding issue with minimum wage. So this is really a great time for us to put our heads together and say, how do we get people paid more, being able to take care of their families, they're investing in their communities, even down to transportation, even down to high quality food access? How do we create livable communities that support everyone so that everyone can actually thrive?
I love that. It's such a beautiful sort of like, not just, I don't want to, you know, the word dream is very powerful, but it's not just a dream of a future. It's like, we can do this if we come together and build these communities and support the leaders, one of which is you, Sherelle. Oh my gosh, I've just been so like impressed and amazed with your insight. As we wrap up, one last minute, can you tell us a little bit about where we can find you on social media?
Yes, I'm just Sherelle_Dorsey all across social media, also at SherelleDorsey.com. I love to be engaged with everyone who's thinking about this work. And as I mentioned before, Upper Hand, the future of work for the rest of us, you can find it across all book purchasing platforms. But I also highly encourage you to pick it up from an independent bookstore or a Black-owned bookstore.
Awesome. And I'm Sydney Fussell. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margot Snipe, the National Health Reporter here at Capital B News. I'm thrilled that you've joined us for this important conversation today about how technology and Black health intersect. I'm joined today by Sheena Franklin and Emily Brown. Thank you both so much for being here today. You've both identified issues or gaps in care and resources when it comes to Black health, and you've made your own solutions. One is the first of its kind digital dermatology and skincare clinic founded by Sheena called Kept. And the other provides folks with affordable, inclusive access to foods and resources necessary to improve their health, founded by Emily, called Free from Markets. You've both chosen tech startups to bridge this gap in health inequities. what racial disparities did you guys notice, and what inspired you all to get started? We can start with Emily.
Great. Thank you again for the opportunity to connect with the capital B community. So for me, it starts with family. You know, I have 2 daughters that have chronic conditions where a special diet is required, yet we were on WIC and SNAP and couldn't get the foods that we needed. And initially I addressed this issue through a nonprofit to get special dietary foods into food banks, into food pantries, but quickly realized through that experience that if I wanted to do the work at scale, like technology was going to be key. And so that's why I started Free From Market, really leveraging technology and the startup space and all the movement around social determinants of health to have the greatest impact in my community. 1 in 3 Americans has a chronic condition where a special diet is required. That's everything from diabetes, heart disease, to food allergies, to GI conditions. Yet 50% of Americans lack access to the healthy foods they need and the resources to change their health and improve their health. And we know that as African Americans, we're over-indexed in those categories, that those health disparities impact us. And so for me, this is about creating a solution for us, by us, so that we can have the health that we need and so that we can thrive.
Yeah, so for myself, it started as most founders, as Emily touched upon, with my own experience, right? So it was my own experience dealing with skin conditions, underlying health concerns. And then I was also working in DC on public policy in the healthcare industry, and even patient access, data privacy. And so my thinking was, how do we center, the patient experience when we're creating machine learning, AI, data, this future of healthcare, but also being really concerned about the fact that I didn't want our communities to be left behind when we're 20 years out and we're still in the same place. And so it was, yes, we acknowledge that, the majority of dermatologists aren't trained, they don't know skin of color. There's probably like 4%, of Black and brown dermatologists. So how do we keep the patient center, but be able to take care of these chronic skin conditions, but also to notice the first signs of lupus or thyroid disease or cancer on Black skin. So that was really, just why I started the company. It was a lot of moving pieces, but it was just we needed better care, we needed better access.
I'm curious for both of you how your experience in sort of health policy has translated to technology. Why technology specifically, and how has that background sort of informed the way the work you do operates now?
Yeah, so for myself, before starting the company, I was at Walgreens. And so I started right around the time we started doing a lot of work with Theranos and bringing our mobile app to market. And so I worked on a lot of policies regarding telemedicine on the federal and state level for licensure, but then also in innovation, right? And so there's a lot of regulatory hurdles with regulation. So that was spurred me, but it was also so I see someone raising millions of dollars, having these partnerships, but there's not a lot of women who look like me who are doing this. So I was like, this is the area that we need to be in. And so every decision I make, especially in healthcare, because it's so regulated, you understand the nuances a little bit more.
Yeah, and so for me, I come to this work again with that lived experience, really from the perspective of a patient advocate. I've spent, countless years serving on hospital boards as a family and patient advisor. I've testified to the FDA, and I've been an advocate working to change policies from the ground level. So that's grassroots community organizing and policy work at the local and state level, as well as the federal level. And so for me, I also really want to center the patient, and I know how important it is for us to build solutions, particularly when we are over-indexed and bearing the greatest burden of the disease. And so therefore, we need to be there as we build that technology. I'm also very concerned, just like Sheena said, with data privacy and all of those other issues that, our data is often leveraged to build solutions, but then we're not engaged as those solutions come to market. And so for me, I'm the only person in the foodist medicine space that looks like me, that's a woman of color that has lived the challenges of managing these conditions. And so I like to say that, all of our work is centered around the patient. And so technology gives us that ability to take all of that experience and turn it into a solution that is scalable, that can really have significant impact on families. And that's really the way that healthcare is moving. Digital health is exploding, and we don't want to be left behind.
Yeah, that's something that I've been noticing, the sort of wave of digital technology, whether it's telehealth or apps, specifically designed to engage specific communities or get communities specific information. How do you think that will bridge the gap in some of these inequities? Tell us a little bit more about both of your startups, what they look like, and how that sort of plays out in practice.
Yeah, so at Free From Market, we're a digital health company in the foodist medicine space. So we are bringing healthy food for individuals with chronic conditions direct to the door. So we have an online closed marketplace where they're able to order the foods that they need and want within their prescribed dietary needs and cultural needs, because food is so personal, it's tied to our identity. And so that allows us to get that healthy food into communities where it might not be. 24% or 1 in 4 Americans live in what the USDA terms a food desert. So we know that healthy food is not always accessible. It may not be in your community. It's not just an affordability issue. It's just not available to you. And so for us, it's getting that food direct to the door through a model that empowers the users. We're not pre-packing boxes. It's not this is your diabetes box. This is the solution that you get. We're not predetermining that. We're allowing and really empowering our users to make the very best decisions and have the food that they need so that they can thrive. So it's getting that food to the door, breaking down those barriers that traditionally make it difficult for us to access food. And I shouldn't call it a food desert, because it didn't just happen. These are situations that were created by policies like redlining, and so we're breaking down those silos. Technology allows us to then get those resources into communities where the physical infrastructure is not available. And then beyond that, because we know it's not just enough to give people access to food, that it's really important about empowering them through education and support. So it's that accompaniment with recipes and content. And then we have a nutrition program where there's a relationship with a registered dietitian and a health coach. And for us, the nutrition world, the nutrition community has also long-standing not been accessible to us. The number of registered dietitians who are people of color, women of color, is limited. So for us, we're being very intentional about our recruitment, who we work with, our training, so that we can bring in providers that are congruent to the populations that we serve. And that is something that, I'm really proud of, that we're building a solution for us, by us, with us, so that we can ultimately lift up the community.
Yeah, that's great. So for us, it's also about access, right? So telemedicine has the ability to close these health equity gaps when it comes to actually receiving care, right? So we have the mindset of we're building upon what the Emilys are out there doing, right? So like you have this community, but where do I go now? Now I need care, right? I actually need to see someone who understands me, right? So the access is about whether you're in the urban area, you have challenges, in a rural area, you have challenges. And then once you're on that telemedicine app, what we're trying to do is, how do we provide the information? How are we formulating questions? How are we starting to break down these barriers that a doctor may have subconsciously or consciously that they're putting onto the patient, right? And so that's the telemedicine part. But we also expand that and we say, how can AI improve recommendations? A lot of folks focus on providing the recommendations for the patient, but for us, we know there's this gap in education. So how do we create this integrative, inclusive, AI system, right? We're trying to be the first in the market with equal representation of skin of color. So now you're providing a platform for these doctors who know it's a problem, who know they don't have the education, but now we're saying, this is A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. So now they're better to make that diagnosis. So that's how we see, the circle of care, if you will. So it's not just dermatology, but it's other people that we're pulling into the system and helping to create a better long-term health.
Yeah, that circle of care you mentioned, and I guess continuity of care, where you go in, you get a diagnosis, and then to be connected right to a provider or to get more information, to have that all sort of in one place, or just to keep people connected to resources, is a lot of work and effort. I'm kind of curious for you guys, how was it to start your own business in the health and tech sphere and be an entrepreneur in this space? What challenges did you guys face?
All of them. So like every challenge you can think of, I think we probably faced it. I think one of the most surprising things that I discovered was, because we were coming from a position of keeping the patient at the center and advocacy, I found a lot of practitioners, doctors, dermatologists, nutritionists, folks of that nature were very interested in working with us, right? So building out our practitioner network wasn't the challenging part. I would say the most challenging part was getting the funding. I know that's something we beat over the head a lot, but I'm sure Emily will agree that there's a lot of things where it comes to healthcare that, there's a lot of regulations, there's a lot of time, and that prevents a lot of folks, being willing to invest. So that is the biggest challenge. And even when it comes to grants, that's like my biggest thing now, like federal grants, like how they're dispersed, how they're evaluated, that I feel like is a real challenge for us right now, and probably going into the future.
Yeah, I would agree. Sheena and I have walked a similar path, and there are not a lot of people that look like us that are walking this path. And so because of that, there's not that familiarity. We don't, we can't go and turn to relatives in our community or, partners in our community to get that experience so that we don't step into those same mistakes. So there, I'd say that, for us, to build a digital company that also has a service component to it in the pandemic has been a challenge. I mean, supply chain is part of our work inherently. And so that has been, in the midst of, every day you turn on the news and there's supply chain issues, that has impacted us, and that has been a little bit of challenge that we've been able to work through. But I would definitely say, raising capital and access to capital is by far one of the greatest challenges of building a company in this space, because these are not, these businesses take significant capital to grow and scale. And so having access to capital is critical, and having it at the right time is critical. And so I know it's not only learning the skill of raising capital, but it's working within that ecosystem. And I agree, healthcare is a industry that's highly regulated. The sales cycles are long. So it takes a lot to get that investment. And then when you have those other historical challenges, simply because there may be biases. I mean, I think I read an article last month that came through Business Insider that reported on Project Diane, and there was only 49 Black women that raised $1 million in VC funds in 2021. 49. So that just demonstrates kind of the very small club that Sheena and I are working to join. I mean, it's an exclusive club.
Yeah, as you guys were talking, I sort of thought about starting a business, no matter what the business is a huge undertaking. And then to think about the fact that the foundation of what you guys have started is addressing systemic issues. So you're going right against some of the biggest hurdles that you could probably imagine. They're systemic. How has that been? Have you found mentorship? Like, how do you sort of navigate that?
Yeah, I would agree. It has been challenging. Systems change does not happen overnight. It is not easy. And for me, I have found great mentors, and those great mentors have come alongside. They've supported me. They have uplifted me, and they've given great advice on how to maneuver. I'd also say that for all of the challenges of the pandemic, and there are many, I mean, just the sheer loss of American life is just devastating. But the pandemic also brought opportunities and an acceleration of innovation, I believe, in digital health. I think that's one of the reasons we've seen digital health just explode, because technology does allow us to have scale, and it allows us to think differently about some of the ways that we do things. And so for me, even though changing systems has been difficult, I've found that building in this environment and this at this time has actually, I don't know if I could build what I'm building, if I could have done it even just 5 years ago. Like the acceleration of innovation in the last 2 years spurred on by the pandemic, because we had to make changes, systems had to respond. And not only did systems have to change and respond, but the acknowledgement of health disparities and what is at the root and what's driving those health disparities, I think for the first time was really acknowledged. I mean, I know that we're talking to the Black community, but the disparities that we've seen, not only in COVID-19, but across chronic diseases that impact our community, they have been there for years. But it wasn't, unfortunately, until the tragedy of George Floyd's murder that the country really acknowledged that there are these just depths of disparities. And so I think with that acknowledgement and the acceleration of the innovation around these systems, I think it makes it a little bit easier to build during this time, but there are still significant challenges.
Yeah, there's definitely, the ongoing challenges. I will say that I have found not just great mentors, great advisors, but we also saw the open acknowledgement, right? With big partners. I believe a lot of the companies that we think about in the healthcare space or adjacent, take my case, for example, in the beauty skincare industry, rather, right? They've known these things. It's not like they don't have the data, the market research. It just was the outward acknowledgement, let us do something about it. And so now I feel as though, and I see they're making efforts, but it's about partnering with them and making them purposeful, right? So it's less marketing and more about results and change, right? So it's not just, hey, there's this company and we work with this company. It's like, how are we actually improving it? Are you doing a pilot with me? Are we putting out surveys? What are we doing? And so I think there are some companies out there who are willing to do that, but I do think it's not going to be solved in the next 5-10 years. I think it's consistently going to be an ongoing process, because you're going to run up against those folks who say, well, it's always worked. Like, why do we have to change it, right? Let's just keep doing what we're doing, because there's benefit for them in that. So it's a balancing act.
And it's sort of the question of, it's always worked, but part of what I look at in terms of health disparities is who have the systems worked for and what that means for diverse communities. I'm curious too, as people are sort of listening and willing to work with you guys, how have people responded, whether that's people you're partnering with or the people who these services are intended to reach? How have folks sort of responded to you guys?
So we've gotten a lot of great feedback, and being an early stage company, the feedback that we've gotten from women, not just Black women, but Hispanic women as well, has been phenomenal, right? So it's, we want to use your services. We want to share the word, like how can we help? Like even when we're talking about sharing the patient data. So one comment was, we know you, we trust you. We see how you work with your partners. Sign me up. Like, how can I be a part of this education medical research process? And as far as outside of the patient world, we've received a lot of interest from corporate partners, simply because we have a different little bit of angle with the AI. So that's been very promising. They're willing to put action and money behind it. So it's just about making sure, like I said before, it's purposeful. It's going to have a long-term impact.
Yeah, and I would agree that, our experience so far as an early stage company is that all of the indicators, all the metrics that we track, all of the feedback that we've gotten from the users on our platform have been favorable. People are really excited about the ability for the first time in many cases to be able to get the foods that they need and they want for their dietary concerns, right in the palm of their hand. To be able to come out of the doctor's office, have a diagnosis, know that you need to make a dietary change and have the resource and support to do it day one is life-changing. And so our early indicators show that we're onto something. The adherence rate is high. I mean, it's like 80%, which is like unheard of. I mean, pharmaceutical therapies range between 30 to 50%. And so being able to provide this to our community has just been phenomenal. And I would say the feedback from our partners and everyone engaged in our work has been key. We work with providers and health systems, to identify patients who may be in need and make those referrals. And so for them, it's about not, being able to give their patients a solution, not just saying, hey, make this change, and then there's no support. So being able to do that and then to see how it's impacting their patients' health outcomes over time is something that they've always wanted, but they haven't had at the tips of their fingers. So it's early on. I anticipate that we'll continue to see positive growth, but all of our indicators today have been positive.
Yeah, you mentioned just walking out of the office and having the information at your fingertips. I know even for me, I did an annual physical and I have to do blood work. I have the slip. All I have to do is show up one more time. And it's taken me weeks to get back just because there's that gap in I have what I need, but I need to go back and get what I need and things like that. When we talk about continuing care, I'm kind of curious, you guys' thoughts on the new waves of apps, but also just telehealth and telemedicine as a way to be able to connect with more diverse providers or people that patients might be more comfortable seeing, especially Black patients. Do you think that is a new way forward? Is it something we should be paying more attention to? Yeah, how have you guys been thinking about that specifically?
Yeah, I mean, we think telehealth is great. We are leveraging telehealth for our nutrition and health coaching program. And this really brings access to our users and our patients who have not had access traditionally. And it also allows us, because it's through telehealth, we're able to recruit diverse providers who otherwise may not be able to interact with users or patients, not in their community. And so, I'm from the Midwest. I live in the Midwest. We do have diversity here, but it's, we're not as diverse as, say, like a New York or some of the other large cities. And so to be able to tap into the talent pools of diverse providers across the country and leverage that and open that up to users who need access, I think is life-changing. And, Sheena mentioned earlier, just kind of the challenges of both patients and consumers in both urban and rural settings. We have found that those challenges in that urban and rural divide are very similar. They may manifest slightly different, but both are dealing with a lack of access to care. And so, having telehealth really bridges the gap and helps bring that access and that continuum of care.
Yeah. So obviously we are a telemedicine platform. That's one of our products. So it's interesting with telemedicine. It definitely has the ability to close the access to care gaps, right? So this is a little bit of a touchy subject for me, but the reality is that there are not a lot of people of color who are doctors, right? So you take that component, you take the component that doctors are not allowed to practice across state lines. That's a huge hurdle as well, right? So what happens is when you have these platforms, I believe the mission is great, the impact could be there, but you're going to be limited, right? So you have to think broader and saying, I can't just have a platform that just has Black people on it to serve Black people. You're not going to get the long-term healthcare outcome. So it's how do I then bring on other providers, whether they're dermatologists, internalists, oncologists, primary care physicians, whatever your platform is, and you make sure that they are, I don't really want to use the word culturally competent, but they've been properly trained, right? And they are aware of their biases or training to help treat the patients on your platform. So I think there's definitely room to grow, but we have to be very cautious and strategic about how we build out the platforms that we're building, right? Because you don't want to have a great idea and then it doesn't go. And then now you have a whole communities of people who are now just trustful of this type of care once again.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can add on to that. I agree. I think Sheena is 100% accurate there. We have to be intentional with how we're building, and we can't fall into the same, footholds that we see in the traditional delivery of medicine. It has to be about that training. It has to be about working with providers so that we can not replicate those same biases that we see in the traditional delivery of medicine and healthcare onto a digital front. And that's why we need builders of color. We need women who are leading digital health companies. We need more people with diverse backgrounds leading and building these companies, which is really important.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit at the end. I'm kind of curious what you touched on, Sheena, about not wanting to repeat some of the same things that make folks distrustful of other systems in the way you're building out your work and building intentionally. That sort of made me think of the fact that there's maybe less room for error, right? There's you have to build right up front, sort of. What ways? So how do you move forward, I guess? I know you touched on Emily having diverse staff up front. Are there other ways that you think people should be thinking about healthcare as they're building new solutions that might address some of that?
I would agree. I think the issues, the stakes are so high for us. I always say, yes, we're building a company, we're building this business, but it is so socially minded and so socially focused that the stakes are very high. If we fail, these are people's lives that we're dealing with people's health. So it's really important that we get it right, which means we have to really take the time, be intentional about the way that we're building, and really, again, I don't want to keep saying the same thing, but I feel like the message is building with people, with our end users in mind. Too often, we see healthcare solutions, healthcare delivery, there's a great idea, but we didn't engage the end user. We didn't engage patients, the ones who are actually going to leverage and use the service. And so I think really centering the patient, what they want, what they need, and really working not to replicate the challenges that we see in that traditional delivery, I think is really key. We have to just be intentional.
Yeah, and just quickly, I'll add to that in two components I said. One, Emily just touched upon is keeping the patient centered, but engaging them. So from the very beginning, when I just had an idea, if I went to a conference, I was talking to women, hey, what's going on with your skin? I knew someone who had lupus. What happened? How'd you know? Do you want to test out this product? Do you want to test out this version? Can you do this survey? Can you jump on a focus call with me? Can you look at these app screens? How are these questions? I mean, like really involving them in the process and then trying to find a way to scale that, right? And another way I feel that we can make sure that we don't fail is making sure our partners are properly aligned to where we want to go, and even our investors, right? So you can have these partners and investors who come in who start to, I wouldn't say manipulate, but they use a lot of influence to get founders to move off their original mark and where they want it to be. So again, it's the intentional mindset, just to keep, pounding that into everyone's head, but it's definitely being highly engaged with your community, right? So that they actually feel, oh, I'm buying into this, I'm pushing it forward, and then we can start to mitigate, poor outcomes or negative experiences.
What should other Black women who are looking to enter a space like this or lead something like this, start something like that, what should they know? What advice do you have? What should women who want to enter this field know?
I would say, just to piggyback off what I just mentioned, with investors, you have to know, I don't want to say purpose because we use that word a lot, right? Like you've got to know your mission. You've got to know your North Star, right? And you've got to know what the difference is pivoting a strategy versus pivoting my initial concept of my company. You have to have that compass. And I think you'll be able to navigate all the other challenges that are going to pop up along the way.
Yeah, and to add to that, I'm going to quote Jay-Z. The genius thing we did was never give up. When you are building a company in this space, you're going to face just so many challenges, and going in knowing that persistence, that tenacity has to be part of your everyday life. Because as an entrepreneur, you're a builder, and builders anticipate that there will be problems, that there will be challenges. And so you have to be prepared to go in and work to find solutions and strategies to overcome those in order to reach your ultimate goal. And so I'd say never give up. That is my number one advice.
And we have about 5 minutes left. I'd love to talk to you guys, given all the knowledge you guys have of the health space from a variety of different perspectives. What from your journeys feels important for Black patients to know? Are there things you've learned about how systems work or resources people should be tapped into? What would you talk to people engaging in the health system as a patient?
What I tell people who are engaging in the health system is that you have to be your own advocate. That this is a system that was not built for us. And so therefore it inherently defaults to this position where our outcomes may not be positive. They may not be the outcomes we seek. And so you have to be vigilant, you have to be present, you have to be an advocate for yourself or your loved one, whoever is interacting in that system, and to be vocal. We've all seen the examples in the news around particularly the challenges in maternal and infant health, and how even when you factor in socioeconomic status, education, all of those things, it just simply comes down to being a Black woman. And so you have to be vigilant and understand the system, and you have to be willing to engage and willing to know when you need to speak up and walk away.
Yeah, I would say based on my experience, every aspect of the healthcare system is regulated, is based on a law. right? So that's the first thing you need to understand. The second thing I would say is you have to be able to push back, right? You know, physicians, they shouldn't be on a pedestal. They are people, right? So you can push back, have conversations with them. And the third thing, if something's not going right, you know, they're board certified for a reason. They have to be approved every year for a reason. You can call and complain. You can call your health insurance company. You can call the state board. Like, you have power as a patient. And those little things that we do collectively can keep changing the healthcare system, but definitely be an advocate, push back, and, you know, don't be afraid to complain at all.
Yeah. And I feel like the whole conversation has been based in my next question, because you guys are actively making what you'd like to see the future of healthcare look like. But that's sort of my final question. What do you guys want the future of healthcare to look like? Where should we be going from here?
Yeah, so for myself, I'm all about virtual first care, right? So that's using telemedicine to identify any early signs, early checkups, especially when it comes to dermatology. So it's less beauty focused. You know, I always say skincare is healthcare. It's not self-care, it's basic hygiene. There's a lot of health related concerns with that. And then being able to then take your mobile app, take it to your doctor, or maybe it's a place where, you know, you have 5 doctors in one place, right? That's still connected to your mobile app, and that mobile app is connected to other, you know, folks. So say like Kept Health is now connected with Emily and her partners. So it's like this whole circle. So I'm all about virtual first care. Absolutely.
For me, it's all about centering equity. For me, it's equity first. How can we continue to build systems that are more equitable and aligned with the outcomes that we want to see? And so everything we do at Free From Market is centering equity and building with that patient-centered approach, and making sure that the patients who are actually bearing the burden of the disease are the ones that we are centering. Because it's not enough just to say we're centering patients, but we need to make sure that we're centering the needs of all patients so that we can really achieve the desired health outcomes that we all seek.
Thank you both so much for your time. I think we're right about at our time for this session. I've appreciated this conversation. I've learned a lot. I know our audience has too. Thank you both for joining me, and enjoy the rest of the programming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our guests for joining us on stage, and a huge thank you to our audience for joining us. If you've enjoyed Capital B Fest, sign up for our newsletters. And remember, the best way to support Capital B is by becoming a member and following our work. You can do both of these things on our website, capitalbnews.org. We've had such a great time introducing you to Capital B Fest, and we really hope to see you again at future Capital B Live events. Thank you.